to be in a room with allies from different women's legal groups and people who are curious and interested in these issues. So I've been given the task to talk about international migration as a way of perhaps rooting where no one is illegal and no borders analysis comes from, and where a lot of the day-to-day work and campaigning that we do, where that's motivated from. I want to start just by asserting what I call four no borders and no one is illegal principles. They're just a way of, in a concise way, expressing where we're coming from, and I state this at the outset, and I do challenge people to take this on at the end if you feel that after hearing all the panelists that maybe some of these things aren't true, because this is what motivates us. This is what we, this is what's rooting our resistance. The idea that all border controls are fundamentally racist and violent, that nation states are inherently oppressive. In the year 2010, there's no way now to justify two sets of people having two sets of rights. In the past, you would justify that by some appeal to racism, by some appeal to superiority, by some appeal to some weird idea that people within a certain territory deserve more rights than other people. But that's no longer tenable. So in maintaining borders, maintaining border regimes, we're essentially complicit in very racist and very violent regimes that, that harm people. Another principle is the idea that people have the right to migrate. There are long-standing historical factors why people migrate. It's part of the human condition. People have the right to resist being displaced, and people have the right to return to places where they have been forcibly displaced. And contrary to ideas of race or community or nationhood that are imposed on us, whether as individuals or whether as collectivities, we're always constantly striving as individuals and as collectivities to assert our own identities as we see them. That idea of self-determination is fundamental. So there's a bunch of slides I have, and I'm skipping a lot because there's limited time. But quickly stated, I think if we examine the patterns of international migration and the history of migration, we're talking about a system of global apartheid. And there's a useful enough definition there by Sally Booker and William Minter. So the idea of global apartheid is not simply a metaphor that we're using. It's actually a form of structural racism where power is embedded in these global processes that are often presented to us, as things that are beyond our control. But one way of expressing that global apartheid analysis in a simpler way, and we do this in our slogans, in our campaigns, is through what we campaign on: status for all, no borders, equal rights for all, regardless of where they're from, access without fear, on and on. Just going to skip ahead to talk about migration, but when talking about migration, it's important to understand that modern day patterns of migration are rooted in of course, history of imperialism and colonialism. Here I have iconic images of the slave trade. I'm basically skipping over 400 years of history in like 20 seconds right now, but I think you understand the importance of understanding that what constitutes the global south and the global north, what constitutes the third world versus the first world, that's all based on very real histories of colonialism and imperialism that live with us today. This map basically expands those countries that are destination countries for migrants and shrinks those places where migrants leave. It doesn't mean that the populations are shrinking, not at all, but it gives you an idea of what migration is all about, because it's not arbitrary. It's not arbitrary at all. It's a very clear pattern of people moving from the global south to the global north, people moving from the third world to the first world, people moving from Africa, Latin America, and Asia to North America, to Western Europe, to Australia, New Zealand, and also to countries in the Arab world. This is not simply about brown people and black people and yellow people having this insatiable curiosity to start undertaking these amazing journeys to get to other places. People are moving because of geopolitical realities of IMF structural adjustment programs that displace people from traditional economies and force them to be migrants, from World Bank schemes, mega projects that displace people, from wars that are concocted in centers like Washington and London. There are approximately, according to the International Organization of Migration, 180 million people every year that move across the border in a permanent way. That's double what it was 20 years ago, and it's expected to double in the next 10 years. So this is migration on an unprecedented scale. I guess a simple way of expressing the motivation is the following. All of us can express in different ways. Many people in the room can share their experiences as migrants. But the situation is this. If you have a passport from Western Europe, say, or Canada or the US, if you're lucky enough to have that passport, because it has nothing to do with how smart you are, if you're lucky enough to have that passport, there's a certain amount of mobility and opportunity that you have in your life. And if you don't have that passport, if you come from the majority world, from the places that suffer from structural poverty, the places that were colonized and robbed, when you come from those villages and those cities, when you come from those favelas and those slums, you are highly motivated, or somebody in your family is highly motivated to get that other passport, to get that Canadian passport, that American passport, that Western European passport. That explains the face of cities like Toronto and Montreal and Marseille and Berlin and Hamburg and France and on and on. That explains the face of those cities today. That is a rational choice, it's a logical choice. And depending on your privilege, and depending on your standing in life, there's a certain amount of risk that you might need to take to get that passport. For some people, it's easy enough to pass the point system and get into Britain, or get into Canada, or to get into the United States. For others, it's about paying a trafficker, it's about getting a false passport, it's about undertaking incredible journeys to do so as well. But the underlying motivation is economic, and it's political, it's a logical choice that's being made, and what's insidious is that the reality of the migrant themselves, because whenever you build a campaign, whenever you build struggle, that should be based on the lived reality of the people that are in struggle. But instead, we have realities being imposed on them, like you're illegal, or you made a mistake, or this idea of the good refugee who's political and the bad immigrant who's coming for economic reasons. But what no-one's legal groups do, what no-border groups do, what people who campaign on these issues do, is instead base our campaigns and base our demands on the lived reality of the migrant. Not blaming the migrant for being a migrant, but rather understanding that being a migrant is an extraordinary expression of self-determination. The slides here just sort of show this iconic global apartheid that surrounds us. We swim in it. An ad for a casino while migrant workers are farming. This is an image from the Canary Islands where tourists are enjoying the sun while African migrants are being detained. The journey of migrants are as logical and as natural as they can be. You get to places that are the shortest journey from point A to point B. And for African migrants from sub-Saharan Africa to get into Europe, you try to get to Tunisia, you try to get to these Spanish enclaves in northern Morocco, Ceuta and Melilla, and cross. So this map sort of shows some of those key migrant routes. But it doesn't do justice to how dangerous those routes are, the exploitation that goes on. As well, European politicians have started, they've imposed this for the last decade or so, Fortress Europe. And those Spanish boats and those Portuguese ships that used to forcibly take Africans and make them slaves and brought them to the so-called New World, those same Spanish ships and Portuguese ships and Finnish ships as part of the European Union are now imposing Fortress Europe. Now, imposing Fortress Europe and making it harder to take the more natural journeys to Ceuta and Melilla in northern Africa across the sea, which is still dangerous, into Western Europe. Enforcing that Fortress Europe has not stopped migrants from making their journeys. It's just made their journey that much more precarious and that much more dangerous. Just to give one example, these are images of migrants who take now the journey from Senegal to Mauritania in Western Africa, which is much longer, much more dangerous. In the year 2006, according to the Red Cross, 3,000 people drowned. 3,000 people drowned making that journey, trying to get from Senegal and Mauritania to the Canary Islands. Some of those boatloads of dead migrants landed in the Bahamas, closer to North America. Tarifa, which is known as a surfer's paradise in southern Spain, is also known for something else. It's known for migrants washing up on the shore because at the end of the journey, at the end of this incredible journey that I'm not even doing any justice to right now because there's lack of time, but just imagine what it takes to leave Cameroon or to leave Uganda to get to Agadez, which is just sort of a stopping point where you pay more smugglers to try to get into northern Africa or to get to Mauritania and Senegal. At the end of the journey at Tarifa, there's a lot of rocks in the sea there near Gibraltar, and those rubber dinghies, they break open and people die on the rocks there.